Okay, ladies and gentlemen, it looks like we're live. Just checking that it's all working right now. Bear with us a moment. I really appreciate everyone tuning in and being a part of tonight's live stream. My name's Matt Bailey. I'm the National Ambassador for the Scotch Malt Whisky Society here in Australia, and I've been doing a live stream every single night now for about a year, which has been fantastic. Every night for a year, and we're just talking all sorts of things, which has been fantastic. And occasionally I'm blessed and graciously joined by a special guest, which is what tonight is all about. So I'd like to formally introduce Matthew Fergusson-Stewart, who has actually a history with the Scotch Malt Whisky Society, which I'm going to ask him about as well, because it's actually one that I'm not very familiar with, because it does predate me. But this is really good. Thank you, everyone who's been tuning in right now. And I'll do some shout outs in just a moment. But Matt, welcome.
Thank you very much for having me. It's a nice shake up to my regular lockdown routine.
Yeah, and it's 5 o'clock where you are right now, so it's about time for a dram, isn't it?
Perfect timing. Yes, got one ready to go.
Yeah, I haven't poured mine just yet. I'm going to do that just now. Bear with me. I'm just going to unpin this. Okay, I think we're good. I just need to make sure we're all live. Make sure everyone's tuning in. Matt Wallace says, boom. Mark Teague, welcome. Rob Scott, Singapore represent. Yes, that's right, Rob. Everyone's tuning in, which is great. Good audience coming in right now. This is great. Thank you so much. Okay, so the idea behind tonight, talking with yourself, is I really wanted to have a chat with you about your, I want to start with your whiskey journey and where it all began. And of course, I'm going to ask you to touch on where your start in the society came from as well. Of course, it's been a long time since then, but and a lot of adventures. But give us a bit of background. Tell everyone who you are in a way.
Sure. Well, I'm Matthew Fergusson-Stewart. You can easily find me online. I'm pretty easy to find. The easiest found on Facebook or Instagram or Twitter through Son of Whiskey. But whiskey has been a passion for quite a number of years. Look, whiskey was, the first thing I stole out of my parents' cabinet when I was 14, 15, because it was what my grandmother always drank. It's what my father always drank.
But you didn't drink it when you were 18 and one day old, just for.
Of course not.
Good.
I pinched it so I'd have it for later. Yeah. But, I started with basic blended whiskies. And, when I was at university, I was buying often things like, Johnny Walker and Chivas Regal. And it was actually my university graduation. My parents took me out for dinner, and I had a nightcap at the end, which was a Lagavulin 16. And the first sip, I thought, oh my God, I don't know if I can finish this. This is intense. By the end of the glass, I was in love with it. And I've been into whiskey ever since. In terms of working in whiskey came a little bit later. I was actually working for a small consulting firm, and my boss was, very particular that everyone must have interests outside of work, like we had time in a consulting firm. And I said, okay, whiskey. He said, right, go out and develop your whiskey interests. So I went online, I looked for whiskey clubs. I found this thing called the Scotch Malt Whisky Society, looked at their tasting schedule, and they had tastings in every state of Australia except WA. Parochial Sandgroper, not happy about that.
And you're a WA boy, aren't you?
I am, yeah, born and raised in Perth. Yeah.
Yep.
So I called the society, and that's when the administrator Susie Torres was just on board. I don't know if she's still there actually, but
she's our member services director right now.
Great. She was like in her first week or something, and here's this guy on the phone complaining he's just joined up. There's no tastings in Western Australia, and I was told pretty directly there's no tastings in Western Australia because we don't have a state manager. By the end of the phone call, I had volunteered. They sent one of the senior members out to meet me and make sure I was able to talk about whiskey, and I started hosting tastings once a quarter. Just part time. I was still had a full time job, but.
Andrew will remark on that's when quarterly outturns were a thing, of course, as well.
Yeah. So I did that right up until the time I left Australia and moved to Singapore.
So you were that's a really cool intro to how you got into it. You're almost vetted by the members in some ways.
I guess so. Yeah. And look, I did all right. My first tasting, though, I got talking to some members afterwards, and we were talking about what whiskies we'd been drinking, and I put my foot in it and said, I just had a nice Bunna Habane the other day. This guy gently says, yeah, I like Bunna Havens too. Didn't call me out, though he could have.
And what year are we talking? What year is that for Perth?
It's about 13, 14 years ago.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Right. Wow.
Yeah, 14 years ago, because I did that for just over 3 years, and I've been here 10 and a half now. So
sort of like, 2005 or 6 or something like that.
Yeah, about that. Yeah.
Yeah. Amazing. And even just on that point there, I mean, do you get back to Perth very often?
Not so much these days. I used to go back regularly around Christmas time, but it's the worst time to go. It's stinking hot, and flights cost twice as much as any other time of the year. So not as often as I'd like, unfortunately.
When you do come back, do you get a chance to explore any of the bars or anything like that, or is it mostly sort of family time? Or
mostly family time. I have done a little bit of that. I've checked out a few that are. I mean, I helped Helvetica's been there since before I left Perth, and I helped them a bit when they were opening. I've been to a few others that have opened since, like Varnish on King Street. A couple of others whose name escapes me because I'm obviously not regular.
And what are some? Is there any sort of changes in that scene that or any changes in, I guess, the drinking culture in Australia or the dramming culture and Whisky Appreciation that you've seen from afar even now?
Oh, look, there was no Whisky Appreciation when I was in Perth, other than, the people that were in Scotch Malt Whisky Society. If you were lucky, a bar had Diageo Classic Malts range.
Yep.
Maybe a few more here and there, but really not very much. Helvetica was one of the real leaders there, but it's grown tremendously.
Yeah. And that's, I mean, the reason I ask that is because it's something that even like Andrew Durbridge has remarked on a number of times in the past about how, Whisky Appreciation in Australia and the pioneers of such and how it's changed over the years. But it's often hard to see that when you're in it. And so if you keep returning to it every so often, it's kind of like you get to see what's changed so much in many ways.
Yeah, that's really interesting. People that are sort of coming into whiskey now or have come in the last couple of years, they've got all these forums and groups they can go on and ask questions and learn really quickly. At the beginning, when we were trying to learn, you didn't find a whiskey lover that often. The internet was new and there was little information, and most of it was wrong. A lot of it still is wrong. But now we've got great online information. We've got great bars. We've got great people who have been around in the scene for a while, and you can learn about whiskey a lot more quickly than you used to be able to. That just didn't exist even 10 years ago.
Yeah. I mean, on that point, actually, I was going to pivot to this a little bit later on, but you've sort of raised it in a way that's quite interesting. The amount of information that is now available to those who want to learn about whiskey and learn about whiskey appreciation and taste whiskey in different ways and capacities has changed dramatically. I know that you used to write, well, you still do obviously, but you Whiskey Molecules and tell me a bit about the background behind that. I mean, you seem to have quite a science brain for it as well as an ambassadorial brain.
Oh, look, I've got a very analytical mind, right? I drink whiskey and I enjoy the flavors and I like to know where they come from. That's to me, it's great to know this whiskey tastes different to that whiskey, but my mind says, why? Why does it taste different? What are some of the things behind this? Where do different flavors come from? What are all the rules that govern that? So I like to kind of dive in and try and work these things out and understand them. And a lot of the things I sort of dive into, particularly when I started, there just weren't the answers out there. One of the first more serious things I wrote about whiskey was on chill filtration. And back then, even most brand ambassadors had no idea what they were talking about. And you'd try and get a deeper understanding of what chill filtration was for and how it worked. And you'd usually get fobbed off or get something that was, obviously wrong. And it took me a long, long time to piece together the whole process of what chill filtration was. So once I had worked it out, I wrote a paper on it, and it was published by Malt Maniacs, and I've since been cited by academic journals because no one had written that. And that's what I like to do, find a question that there's not an easy answer for, but still one that's not so difficult that I can actually still go away and work it out. Sometimes I experiment, sometimes it's, all secondary research. And once I work it out, I share it. There's no point keeping it to myself, right?
No, exactly. And that sharing of information is what has dramatically changed over the years as you've been in it long enough now to have seen the sort of the birth of whiskey forums in many ways and that moving to Facebook groups and even on Twitter being huge for a long time as well.
Yeah. You know what? There's Scotch Malt Whisky Society Australia group page I actually set up.
You set up the group page that people are watching this on right now.
I did. You know, those old guys like Andrew Durbridge didn't know how to use Facebook, right? So
he's going to watch this and he's going to get you on that
yes, one. Yes. He knows it's true though. But, you know, Facebook was very new and people were starting to get into it. And I said, you know, like this is happening. I'll set up a group page. So I set it up. When I left to come to Singapore, I passed it over for other people to look after.
Which was one of the first, if not the first, whiskey group on Facebook when it comes to sort of like discussion of around whiskey.
Yeah,
in Australia, I should preface, but yeah.
I don't know. I don't want to say it was the first. It's certainly the first I knew about. I couldn't find anything before that, but you know, there may have been stuff there. But yeah, it got active and certainly became one of the great resources fairly quickly.
And it grows. I think we get like 8, 10, sometimes 15 new requests into it every day.
Wow.
So it's always growing, which is great. And it's for those who are watching right now, thank you so much. And Matthew, what are you dramming on? What I should have asked that just before.
Yeah. So as you were saying before, this would probably be illegal in Australia, but I bought from a bar, from Quake Bar, these little samples that are mystery whiskies, and these were for people to buy and take home and enjoy. So there's 4 in the set, and I actually have no idea what I'm drinking, but I know it's peated. I'll try and work it out. It could be a long row, actually.
So you're starting from the sort of the peated end, then you work way backwards to the nice light floral end.
Well, it's not what I intended, but all they have on them is a number, a la Scotch Malt Whisky Society. But there's no code I can look up. I opened bottle number 2247, and I got no idea what that means. So.
You don't know what? Okay, well, neither do I. 2247 would be a I can't remember the code for 22. That's okay.
Yeah, it's not an SMWS code. It's just what the bar was using. So I don't know. It's a good whiskey, but I'll ask them later.
So one of the points I want to move on to was asking. We've sort of touched on some of your early journey, which I want to just stick on just for a moment. Is so after SMWS, you moved to Singapore. Was that for William Grant and Sons?
No, not at the time. Actually, it was a bit of a sore point for a while, but I had the idea that I was going to set up Scotch Malt Whisky Society in Singapore.
Right.
I didn't move for that purpose. I'd become engaged to the woman who's now my wife, who's Singaporean. So I moved to Singapore to be with her, and I thought I'd do Scotch Malt Whisky Society full time. Then things got really busy for them, and they said, look, we just don't have the time to do a Singapore chapter right now, particularly as it's not going to be huge volumes. So I had to go away and find a real job for a while.
Right.
I did a little bit of part-time, bit of consultancy work. Then I ended up working at the Old Alliance, which is, you know, one of the best whiskey bars in the world. Absolutely incredible place, and a great place for me to go and keep learning. You know, working with Emmanuel Dron, who has incredible whiskey knowledge, range, palate.
I mean, the effects of Emmanuel is known around the world, or especially at least in Australia. He's quite well known amongst whiskey circles, and
yeah, absolutely,
an incredible bar to boot as well. Like it's probably safe to say it's one of the widest access points of interesting and old and rare and discontinued bottlings around ever released.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely incredible. Yeah. And look, there's now other bars in Singapore that have a similar kind of range concept where they have the rare, old, and unique and unusual stuff. But the Old Alliance was a trailblazer there.
And I watch with envy at the bottles that Emmanuel opens each week from like, oh, what's this 1967 Lefroy? It's like, yeah, okay, cool. Just it's, I guess it's because it's Tuesday.
It's a pretty good whiskey too, having had it there. Yeah.
Daniel Millhouse says it's the MFS. Yes, it is. We're chatting live tonight with Matthew Fergusson-Stewart. For those who've just tuned in, there's a lot more people live now than when I first introduced him. He's joining us all the way from Singapore, which isn't too far. He's 2 hours behind at the moment, but it always feels like a stone's throw from Australia in some ways. And
it's not far. Come and visit me when you're allowed out again.
Yeah, no, I will. I'm looking forward to it. That'll be great. And David Taylor says, hi from wet Tassie. Darren Howie, evening, guys. Good to see you, mate. And Matt Wooler says, if only it was that easy now. I think he's referring to that earlier comment about your entry into the industry in some ways.
Yeah. Yeah, look, it's not easy now at all.
No, but which is kind of strange in some ways because the industry has grown so much as well in that time in the last 10 years that there's a lot more opportunities to because there's a lot more brands, I guess. And
But also, few people leave the industry. They don't want to. They love it, so they stick around. If we all worked for 5 years and moved on and created jobs for other people, that'd be easy. But no, we become lifers.
Yeah, exactly. We become lifers in these jobs. Well, which is one of the next points I want to jump into. What would be some of your tips then for those who do want to get into the industry? Because I often, that's a question I'm sure you get asked a fair bit, and one that I know I do get asked a fair bit. If there's two questions I get asked the most is, how do I become a whiskey ambassador, and when is the Society of Bottling Australian Whiskey? So outside those two questions, what would be sort of in your tip? What would you be saying to aspiring people wanting to work in the trade in some capacity?
Yeah, look, when people ask me particularly about becoming a brand ambassador or a whiskey ambassador of some kind, they often lead in with like, I know a lot about whiskey. You have an awesome job. I want to do it too. To which I usually have to say, look, knowing something about whiskey is important. Yeah, very much so. But your job is not just to know about whiskey. Your job is a communicator for the brand, right? So you have to be presentable, representative of that brand, and you have to be an exceptional communicator. You have to be able to get up and talk to a group of 2 people or a group of 200 people. You have to be able to write to talk about whiskey. You have to be able to follow up. There's all these other things that come with the job. You have to have a great network. You have to have a great relationships in the on trade. If you know a lot about whiskey, but you don't have any of that other stuff, then I'm sorry, but you're actually never going to get a brand ambassador job because they're super competitive. And a lot of people know about whiskey and have those other aspects as well. So they're going to get the jobs before you. Network the hell out of it. Get to know everyone, anyone in the industry. Make a good impression on them. Never burn a bridge because this is a small industry. Well, it's not a small industry, but it's a very heavily interconnected industry. If there's someone I don't know, I know someone who knows them, and I can track them down pretty easily. So never upset anyone. Never do the wrong thing.
No, and I think that last point is quite important because, as you say, it especially in a country as small as the population of Australia, that can always come back around to bite you sometimes.
And I've seen it happen to people, unfortunately. But yeah, it definitely does happen.
Yeah. So it's more about being a communicator, and especially if you're looking for those kind of ambassador roles, it's about being a great communicator and a great networker in some ways. Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah. You've also got to be professional and accountable. Like if you're working as a brand ambassador, they'll probably give you an expense account, and some people tend to go a bit yee-haw about that and have a good time with it. But no, you're accountable for that money. You've got to report on it. You've got to have those reports in on time. It's got to be justifiable expenditure towards advocacy of the brand. And some people when they
so buying endless drams of 1940 Macallan probably isn't really an expense then, is it?
Particularly if you don't work for Macallan, yeah.
No, I'm just checking. Yeah, just checking. It's all right. Yeah, that was good. Well, okay. So, and on that point as well, I mean, in terms of that kind of role, this is a really interesting one that I often come across. What do you think has been, I guess, some of the driving changes of that role over the last 10 years? Because as you say, the industry has entirely changed. The number of distilleries producing spirit, the number of people making great spirit, the number of people getting involved with it. But in terms of the role, like what you've had a career in, how have you seen that change, or more succinctly, more accurately, what have you seen where you've needed to adapt your role into doing that?
Yeah, I mean, from a pure brand ambassador perspective, there's certainly more accountability and scrutiny than there used to be, and it's more competitive. I got my job with William Grant & Sons working on Glenfiddich straight out of Old Alliance. I was the only person they interviewed. I mean, I had been working hard to set up my reputation so that I thought I was the best choice in market, but literally they spoke to me and they said, yeah, okay, let's go ahead. When I left William Grant & Sons, there was a huge number of applications. And when I would, on some of the earlier interviews before I left, I sat in on them and I said, I was not at the standard when I got the job. If I was where I was 5 years earlier when I started with William Grant & Sons and I was up against these guys, never would have got it.
Right.
So yeah, it's become more competitive, more intense. There is more, it used to be a little bit more cowboyish. They used to let the brand ambassadors have a little bit more of a free reign, but whiskey companies aren't dumb. They like to have return on their investment. They like to see that it's been spent well. So depends on the brand, of course, but there's been more scrutiny and accountability than there used to be.
I guess that's important. You know what, I think one of my favorite ever stories was actually an old friend of mine who worked for Albert's music group, and they're the publisher for AC/DC among all these other acts, and so they're a big publishing house. And he used to work at Sony Records in the 90s, and this is when CD was king. These companies were basically set up offices just with money printing machines out the back. And he said that he got dragged into his boss's office once. This is my favorite story. He got dragged into his boss's office, and he said, he goes, "Oh, what's the problem?" He goes, "Look, you're in a bit of trouble." And he said, "Oh, why?" And he said, "You're not spending enough each week on your expense card. You need to be spending way more on these artists and these lavish nights, and your champagne bill needs to be higher, and this and that." And it's I guess we've seen that change, obviously, not just in music, but also in the entire whiskey industry. As you say, accountability for actions that needs to be a lot more scrutinized.
Yeah, and look, in the last 10, 15 years, where distilleries have really wanted to spend their money is actually in increasing production capacity. So there's been huge amounts invested in that, and this is many, many millions of pounds we're talking about to expand a distillery. So the money's definitely coming in. We've all seen the price of whiskey go up. But that's where it's going. It's not just lining the owner's pockets. It is being invested for the future. Which is
actually a really good segue to the next question in some ways. I mean, as you've just said, I mean, the last 10 years has sort of been investing in the future and increasing production. I mean, on a larger scale, like in Scotland, we've seen the likes of, Edrington pumping heaps into Macallan. We've seen all these Diageo opening new distilleries. We've seen all sorts of things happening like that, increasing grain production. Where do you think once we reach maybe a bit more sort of gap between supply and demand, where do you think the next 10 years will be then, for not just for Scotland, but of course for as a broader scale around the world?
Yeah, a lot of people involved in whiskey have been there for a lifetime or a multi-generational members of the whiskey industry, right? Their parents did it, their grandparents did it. If you look at William Grant and Sons, many generations of the same family. They have a deep understanding of how the industry works and how it has worked. A lot of people that come into the industry from finance backgrounds, marketing backgrounds, whatever, to work on big brands, forget that the history of the Scotch whiskey industry is boom and bust. It always has been. Pattinson crash and the decline in the 80s, and we've just ridden through one of the biggest booms Scotch whiskey has ever seen. It can't go forever, right? It can't keep growing at the same rates as it's grown over the last 10 years. That's not going to happen. Will it be a hard landing, or will it plateau and slow down, or will it just keep going with much more marginal growth? I don't know, but I don't think it's the time to invest in those very, very high-end expensive bottles and expect that you're going to flip them for big coin later. If you want to buy them and drink them, great, or save them for your retirement, great, but you're not going to flip them in 6-12 months time like everyone used to. There might still be some growth in there. I've been predicting it's going to plateau for a while, and I've been wrong, but I'm going to be right eventually.
But yeah, it'll be a crash. It's more of a plateau coming rather than a crash, I guess, in that respect.
Yeah, we'll have to see how that works out. But, there's been a lot more competition for whiskey in recent years. Irish whiskey's on the rise. Premium rums are really getting their act together and actually learning how to talk about rum instead of letting everyone just think it's a cowboy category where anything goes. Even things as simple as craft beer. I mean, people that love good single malt whiskey are flavor explorers, right? And you can get that experience from craft beer as well. Craft gins also. So there's no one category that's kind of biting into Scotch whiskey. But when you add them all up and people starting to explore flavor and wanting to try new and different things all the time, that means some of those people that flooded into Scotch whiskey are going to start flooding out. And sorry, I talk about Scotch whiskey almost exclusively. So a lot of what I say about Scotch does apply to other things, but I'm more used to talking about Scotch specifically.
Mm-hmm. And of course, I guess the new world will sort of follow on a lot from the leaders in the industry around Scotch whiskey.
Yeah.
Of course. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And look, Scotch whiskey has often not done itself very many favors. A lot of the marketing for some brands have worked it out, but other brands, their marketing is still very tartan and bagpipes. There's still It's less and less, but there's still some
quite parochial.
Yeah, there's also sexism. The idea that either that women don't drink whiskey, or the idea that women need a nice, easy, accessible whiskey to understand whiskey, which is not true at all. They just need someone to talk to them in the same way that they would talk to anyone else.
Yeah,
whiskey can be complex.
I still can't believe you see that sometimes, and we see it. I mean, we see these. There is still that level of. There's still sometimes a level of sexism and very, like, as you say, outdated ways of selling Scotch whiskey, which I find fascinating that it even still flies today.
Yeah, look, I find it doesn't happen so much. You don't see it from within the brand ambassador community anymore. Or rarely, if ever, have I seen that. They'll respect knowledge no matter what age, race, gender, whatever you are. You do unfortunately get it in whiskey community. This idea that women don't understand whiskey or can't understand whiskey, or we should give them something light and delicate as a way to ease them in, and that's frankly rubbish.
Yeah, you do see it in community, even subtle stuff like an opening statement of "Hi, gents." As a discussion point or something. Yeah.
I'm as a brand ambassador, I've always been very careful about that. If, as sometimes happens, the room is entirely men, that does happen, and that bothers me, then I'll say, hello, gentlemen. But that is a point. That does actually happen. I've never kind of organically just had a tasting where it's only women who have showed up. But I have had tastings where...
I have. There you go. There's one gig I've done that you haven't. There you go.
No, I have done women only ones, but they were within special groups where they organize at their membership base, so they were all women.
Right,
but one that's organically come together and has never been all women, just by circumstance.
No. And I think that will change. I mean, I think it's often, as we said, it's just that marketing of that spirit has taken some wrong turns over the years, and I think 90s Scotch whiskey marketing has a lot to answer for as well.
Absolutely. Hugely.
Not just in that category, of course, also in they're always that promoting that age statement is everything kind of approach, and that sort of that era of, well, whiskey's not good until it's minimum 12 years old, sort of it has to be 12 to be whiskey sort of approach. Right,
which we know is not true, but now a lot of brands are trying to say the opposite. It's not about the age statement, it's about how good the whiskey is, and we are now telling the truth about that. But everyone says, but hang on, a few years ago you were saying the opposite.
That's right.
So they're skeptical, and they're right to be skeptical because we were bullshitting them before.
Yeah. Brendan Pillai says, how's it going, Matt and Matthew? Good to see you, Brendan. Are you tuning in from Singapore into this Australian live stream of someone in Singapore? This is too surreal.
That is the politest thing Brendan's ever said to me.
You heard it here first, Brendan. You heard it here first. No, lovely bloke. And Brendan, last time we caught up was almost a year ago to the day where we saw each other at Brooklady Distillery. So I hope we can have more of those encounters later this year when travel is a bit more possible. And Martin, just on that comment, Martin Eber, by the way, has tuned in. Good to see him.
Hey, Martin.
Wasn't that long ago we saw Age Matters everywhere from Pernod, I think. Yeah, Age Matters. Yeah, I remember that campaign. I think that was a Pernod campaign. I can't remember.
They were kind of the last to drop it. Yeah, I think they realized a bit late that not only was it not true, but it didn't suit where the industry was going with older stocks being depleted. So they hung on a little bit tightly with that one for too long, but they've dropped it now. Yeah.
We've had a question through from Martin as well saying, what you drinking, guys? Now, Matthew already said that he's on a mystery sample from Quake Bar, and I'm on a 26.136, which is a distillery in the Highlands. Here we go, 26.136, 1 and 254, Candy Floss and Carousels. That was from May Outturn, a lovely young 8-year-old juicy oak and vanilla from a waxy distillery. Lovely stuff. Yes, it was Face Shield. That's right, Brendan. You are correct.
We know our 26s, don't worry.
Yeah, we know our 26s. Love a good waxy 26, and I especially love these younger ones that we've been getting through. A couple of 7, 8, 9-year-olds that are just fantastic. Really lovely spirit quality there. A couple of comments coming through. Sam Lacardi says, 2 of the first brand ambassadors I ever followed on Instagram and have been great role models for a young ambassador like himself. Great convo tonight. I really appreciate that, Sam.
Oh, that's awesome. Cheers, Sam.
Joel Rinaldi says, do you think the big distilleries will change their OBs given the increase in knowledge of the average drinker? This is a really good question. Also with an increase in demand for single casks. So the question is, do you think big distilleries will change their core range given the increase of the average drinker?
Yes and no. And I'm not trying to be evasive in saying that. Distilleries, particularly the ones that have been around a long time, tend to be conservative in how they change, right? They are not, because they think the market might be shifting a bit, get rid of their core range and change it for something else. What they do is bring in other bottlings. So, worked for Glenfiddich for a long time. The core range has been a Glenfiddich 12, 15, 18 for a long time. They've upgraded packaging, made that look a bit different, but they haven't changed the recipes, haven't changed the liquid, haven't changed the ages. What they have done is bring in the experimental series and stuff like that. It's a bit higher in ABV. Balvenie, same company, brought in their single barrel stuff, but they haven't necessarily gotten rid of their core range or changed the core range too much. Because although knowledge is growing, we need to remember that as kind of whiskey community, we're still less than 5% of whiskey consumption. We're important to them, but they're not going to make their business decisions based around us. They're going to pay attention to what we're saying because they know what people in the community say tends to be a message that leaks out into wider whiskey consumers. But no, they're not going to say, I'm changing my 12, 15, and 18 to cask strength now because the whiskey community will love that. It's just not the right market for it. It's not big enough.
On that point, and that's a really good answer. Just as a spin-off comment to that, do you think that as the wider whiskey community grows in different ways, as we were sort of discussing before, as Facebook groups or whatever the platform may be, whether it be on Instagram or Facebook or TikTok or whatever, do you think that these communities will, as they grow and they could have 30, 40, 80, 100,000 people in them or whatever, like you're talking that influence of the, I guess, single malt appreciation, as you said, it's less than 5%.
Yeah.
And single casks, by the way, Joel, is probably 0.1% of that 5%. So we're talking, it's very small bickies, but it's,
Yeah, look, you might have 10,000 people in a Facebook whiskey group. How many of them read everything and comment every day? 90% of them are quiet most of the time, right? I was just going
very small engagement. That is true. Yeah.
Yeah, and it might be a good, busy, active group, but even if you've got 10,000 people in the group and it's busy and active, that may be because you got a few hundred people that are on there every day. You've probably got 5,000 people that read a bit here and there, might never have put a post in the group, only occasionally comment, that kind of thing. They're there, they might have asked a question because they wanted to know something specific. That just because they're in that group doesn't mean they're becoming a whiskey nut, right? And this was something, the influence and the importance of whiskey community is something I definitely over-influenced when I started working for a big brand. And it used to annoy me that I thought they sidelined and ignored community. And I got sat down and explained to me with numbers and facts and figures by someone senior in the business. It's just not that important to us. It's not important to us. That's just not where the market is, right? And there was appreciation, understanding that community is important. And we would do special tastings for them, like a 15-year-old deconstruction taste. I did one of those with Brendan Pillai in his bar at the Single Cask. We had cask strength samples of the 3 different whiskies that went into Glenfiddich 15 and did a deconstruction. The community loved it. But the brand's not going to release those 3 bottlings of cask strength components of Glenfiddich 15 because it's just not going to sell.
It reminds me of it was actually a Habiki tasting I went to. I attended maybe even 5 years ago, and it was they brought all the components like the puncheon and the sherry cask and the bourbon cask, kind of the components of the blend as single malt components. Yeah, and it was, and the grain as well, the cheetah grain or whatever. So it was like all the components of it all brought in together. Is it cheetah? Oh, look, I can't remember. Sorry. But it was, and that was, it was fascinating because it was like, but of course, a lot of the room wanted to taste more of those components rather than the actual blend itself. And I think it was a bit of a strange exercise for the brand because they were sort of saying, well, it's like, oh, the sum of the parts makes the best at the end, but everyone was sort of like, well, we just want to taste the sum of the parts. But it's a very, very, very small audience, of course, as you say.
Yeah, I was in a kind of a semi-deconstruction style tasting the other day, which some of the Singaporean crew here will remember. And the whiskey we had just before the final whiskey was the favorite of the night by far.
Yeah, right. And that's, I guess, one of those roles of an ambassador when structuring a tasting is where to put what in a lineup is always fun. And, yeah,
absolutely. But you know, this was a deconstruction of a whiskey that's not meant for whiskey community, but most of the people there were whiskey community, so they're going to have different taste. It was in fact a blended whiskey, and we were having some of the whiskeys that went into it. It's a blended whiskey that does well, but we had a largely single malt whiskey drinking crowd.
Yep. Moving on to your local dramming scene is in appreciation and what the overall sort of your takes on the Singaporean whiskey appreciation looks like, especially compared to anywhere else in the world.
Look, and really quite impressive because I've seen it go from nothing, from zero to probably one of the most sophisticated, most developed outside of UK, Europe. We have a large number of whiskey bars, proper whiskey bars here that focus on whiskey. There's probably around 25 of those in Singapore. Very different styles, catering to different tastes. We've got a large number of whiskey groups and communities and different WhatsApp chats and different cliques and friendship circles and fallings out. And but when you look at bars like, you know, the Old Alliance, the Single Cask, the Swan Song, and quite a few, you know, the Wall. There's an incredible range of whiskey, even La Maison de Whiskey, the Quake bars. You can get almost anything here, from you know, modern OBs to very rare niche IBs to stuff that's been in a bottle for 40, 50 years. And there's a market for it, and people appreciate it, and they'll get together and drink it together and talk about it.
And so you do see a sort of a strong connection in Singapore with, I guess, some of the more out there and interesting bottlings then in some ways, if it's
absolutely. Yeah.
And the brands must know that and must preference that in some ways as well, which is good.
Yeah. Look, to them, we're never going to be Taiwan because Taiwan is the one of the biggest whiskey consuming markets in the world, which is kind of nuts for such a small country. They get all the best prices. They get all the best releases. We do get a bit of parallel coming out of there, which is nice. So we still get to try some of it. We'll never quite be Taiwan, but brands do like to treat Singapore as a showcase market because it's such a regional travel hub. Taiwan's got the advantage that whiskey is incredibly cheap there because the taxes are incredibly low. Singapore doesn't have that.
Yeah, no, the taxes are quite ridiculous in Singapore. Well, from what I've heard. As a means of almost like a bit of a double plug here, you recently co-wrote something because you just triggered it for me. You co-wrote something with our cellar master Andrew Durbidge on parallel importing.
Yeah, I did. Yeah,
Talk us through a little bit of that. How did that come about? What's the sort of the take on that?
So, you know, I wanted to write about that because there's different points of view there, and you hear people say very different things, and unless you heavily involved in the industry, not just being a consumer, it's hard to weigh up those voices. What do they mean? Parallel importers are obviously going to say it's 100% safe. It doesn't matter. You can buy it. We're cheaper. We're looking after you. Brands, official importers will say, well, look, there's a risk there that's counterfeit, bad product, and so on. Yeah, that risk actually does exist, but it's small. Whereas parallel importers will tell you, no, there's no such risk. It doesn't exist. The truth often, and in this case, does lie somewhere in between.
Between no risk and very little.
Yeah, between you're going to die of methanol poisoning if you buy parallel trade, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with it. It's 100% safe. It's better because it's cheaper, you know, and it's probably closer to the safe side, but there are risks. And you know, Andrew had raised great examples about certain brand where some of their product has come through very hot and dry and tannic and woody. I don't think he wanted to mention the brand name, so I won't mention it either. But I know a lot of Australian whiskey community know what he was talking about.
We know which brand he's talking about and which retailer, but it's probably best not to reference it.
Yeah. Yeah. But look, that's actually the second article I wrote with Andrew. I mean, that's one I posted and got some good feedback. The first one I wrote with Andrew was actually a much more geeky one, and that was on methanol in whiskey.
Yep.
And there's all kind of byproducts come out of a distillery, and we know we always cut the foreshots in whiskey production, which is where the methanol is. We do recycle that, but we had a question like, what happens to that methanol? It's going to build up, and at some point you're going to have to get rid of that, right? But we never hear about that as a byproduct that needs to be dealt with. And actually, it's not a byproduct. We're not actually taking out methanol from whiskey. We're just making sure it never gets too concentrated.
Right.
But that was really quite a complicated one. But yeah, go ahead, have it read.
And I think that's on Whiskey and Wisdom and your site as well, or?
That one went up on Whiskey Molecules because that was a geeky one. Yeah.
Yeah, right. Too geeky for even Andrew. Okay, there you go. You heard it here first. That's the second dig tonight.
Yeah. But look, Andrew was one of the first kind of influential, knowledgeable people that I knew in whiskey from, when I started it. Probably the first. His Whiskey and Wisdom blog, I think, is one of the absolute best out there.
Agreed. Absolutely.
Informative, sometimes hilarious as well. He's got a really nice balance, a really nice tone in how he writes. And he's been in many ways a great mentor in the whiskey industry, which you no doubt know because you've been working there for a while now as well. Yeah,
he's my mentor. He's one who's he actually, well, as has been discussed before, he was actually responsible for recruiting me at the society.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I've got to work with some amazing people over the years. I got to other than Andrew, I've worked with Emmanuel Dron at the Old Alliance. I've worked with Ian Miller at William Grant and Sons, and these are names that open doors for me. If I talk about my whiskey hidden history, people know these people and respect them.
Yeah, yeah. So, just delving into some of your more recent history, then. So after William Grant and Sons, you took a role at I'm going to get this wrong. It's the whiskey shop. And
you did get this wrong in the invitation. Yeah, it's the whiskey store, but close enough.
Store and shop. Okay. I was close. I'm sorry.
That's pretty close, man. Yeah.
Okay. It has the word whiskey in it. I got that far along. And what was your role there? What was the go with that?
So Chief Marketing Officer. I love my time at William Grant and Sons as brand ambassador. I'm a little bit older than I look, and brand ambassador work becomes it's not really an old person's game, I wouldn't think. Not because old people can't do it, just because the travel and the drinking and all that, it gets tiring, it gets exhausting. And plus, having a young kid all the time traveling away from family was not great. So I wanted something a little more regular hours at home, stable, less drinking kind of thing. So I went to work for the whiskey store as Chief Marketing Officer.
Right. And that you were there for a couple of years at least, weren't
you? Just under 2.
Okay. Yep.
Yeah.
And is it too early to ask what your next adventure might be, or is we are broadcasting live? Remember that? So.
Yeah, we are. It's still a stay tuned from me. You'll have to wait and see on that one.
That's very cool. I very much respect that, but it would be remiss of me not to ask.
Of course. I'll make sure you're one of the first people that know then.
Thank you so much. Jason Davies, Ryan Marshman. Good to see you, Ryan. I hope you're well.
Jesus, Ryan came online for this. That's a big move.
Yeah. It is a big move. Stuart Glasgow, Zeno Davidoff, Pete Visky. Good to see you guys. Thank you so much for tuning in. I'm chatting tonight with Matthew Fergusson-Stewart, who's had probably one of the most interesting and storied careers in whiskey of anyone I know, and I really appreciate you taking the time to chat with us this afternoon or this evening-ish for you in your case, or this evening for me as well. It's 7:45. If any questions are coming through, I'll take them, but I'll ask you just one more.
Yeah,
I guess we sort of talked about the next sort of trends in terms of distilleries, but what would you see as maybe some of the next trends in terms of, communication and appreciation and marketing of such? It's kind of, that's really sort of your expertise is seeing that. And you've been at the coalface of that as well.
Yeah. And what's really interesting is this is a period where not so much brands, because brands are a bit slower, but the people in the coalface actually selling product have had to pivot really, really quickly to work out how they're going to sell product to people, right? Because all the channels and regular consumption patterns are incredibly disrupted. Quite disrupted in Australia, where it's about 50% on trade, 50% off trade. Here in Singapore, it's generally about 90% on trade, 10% off trade. People don't really drink at home that much. They go out to drink. And that's been shattered. And there will be a lot of people paying very close attention to how people have adapted and responded to that, because this probably won't be the last time something like this happens. There might be other rounds with COVID-19 of being locked down again, and people really want to work out how they can continue to do business and promote brands and grow in an environment we've never really worked on before. We have seen brands already try and work and use a lot of technology. Like I did some great interactive technology stuff when I was with Glenfiddich. But all the tastings I ever did, bar one, were face to face. Right? I did one broadcast live from a warehouse at Glenfiddich once, which was a lot of fun. But other than that, I've always been in front of the people talking to them. And I think brand ambassadors are going to start thinking, how do I use a different medium better? How do I use Zoom or other online formats to present myself better? And it's something I've been wondering about. I'm quite good at managing a room face to face, but this is a very different format now. So how can I be good at this one as well?
Not just good, but also like effective.
Yeah, yeah.
It actually makes sense for the brand to be on that platform or that positioning. Yeah.
Yeah. And hopefully it's not too successful, because if it is, then they'll start to consolidate and centralize where brand ambassadors are, right? And there won't be brand ambassadors around the world in each market. They'll just have a really, really good one in Scotland or something. Yeah. Hopefully not. We don't want to see it go that way. But
have 4 Richard Pattersons sitting around Scotland somewhere.
Yeah. But as a broader trend, I think a lot of companies that have always said, no, you can't work from home, that's not possible, have now had to make it possible. And they're going to see that it's actually going to work, and we're going to see less people in offices on a regular basis. We are going to see more telecommuting because people know that they can make it work now. I don't know if that's a good thing. Probably not entirely a good thing.
Yeah, exactly. A question from Martin Eber. In your opinion, which brands / distilleries / companies are really nailing whiskey appreciation in the new / current world? I guess he means in the post-COVID world, apart from SMWS Australia, of course. Yeah, thanks, Martin. So kick us off on that.
I've been working really deeply on some other projects at the moment. I haven't really been paying a hell of a lot of attention, but I do see what some of the people that are close to me are doing, and I see my replacement at William Grant & Sons, Brett Bailey, who took over for Glenfiddich, actually doing an incredible job. Excellent
surname, yeah.
He was a bit shy with this, but I got it out of him eventually. He's Phil Bailey's nephew. I'm like, your drinks industry royalty.
Yeah. Okay, there you go.
Different spelling of Bailey. He's B-A-Y.
Yeah. Can't all be perfect. That's okay.
Yeah. But no, he's doing a lot of online stuff, and he's engaging exceptionally well. Some brands seem to me and I'm not going to name names here, not really to be making an effort. They're just seeing what kind of sales promos they can do to get them through.
Yeah.
I've done some work with Diageo. I did a tasting with them the other week. They have people in-house, but Diageo, in a lot of ways, people used to see as, the Darth Vader of the whiskey industry, but they've got me to do a few tastings for them now, and they let me say what I want, right? So in the tasting, I will give my genuine opinions of the stuff we're tasting. It's not always good, and they keep asking me back. And I actually really respect that approach, that they've actually got the kind of cojones to let someone in a tasting organized by them come in from outside and speak their mind on the product.
Yeah, that is rare. That is especially rare.
And it's not the Diageo of 10 years ago either.
No. And I think that approach, I mean, people love to treat the big guys in any realm, whether it be the big beer company or the big spirits company, whatever it is, as always, let's say the Darth Vader of that realm. And I think that's a bit unjust, especially now as well. But some great questions coming in, which I'm going to jump on. Scott Mansfield, who is our Queensland state manager.
Yeah.
Asks, we seem to have so much more information about the provenance and the specific origins, i.e. cask history of a single cask, etc. how do you see this can be incorporated into the role of a brand ambassador? And a follow-up, what do you see as an environmental concerns will come to be a factor?
Oh, okay. So provenance of casks specifically,
let's jump into that. Well, we seem to have so much more information about the provenance and origins of each spirit and each cask, I guess.
Right.
And how do you see this can be incorporated into the role of a brand ambassador? That's a good question.
Yeah. Well, the thing is, these are complex messages, right? And you don't put complex messages on the tube, which the bottle comes in. You don't put them on the bottle. You don't put them in an advertisement in a magazine, because people don't take in complex messages in that format. You can put them on your website where, 3 people will read them next year. But really your only channel for communicating messages of this complexity and this depth are through brand ambassadors, because a brand ambassador has 2 responsibilities, as I see it. So I'm using hands, but they're just below the level of 2 responsibilities for a brand ambassador. They educate and they entertain, right? If a brand ambassador stands up there to educate the whole time, people are going to feel like they're in class and they're going to get bored and they're going to walk out. They can't just entertain, because people are there to learn something about the whiskey. But if you can present that kind of information in an engaging, entertaining way, people are going to remember it, some of it, and take it in. I think that kind of information is solely the domain of the brand ambassador, because unless you really want to know and read a journal article, you're not going to get that information any other way. In terms of environmental concerns, I think was another part of that question.
Well, you said as a follow-up, what do you see as how environment concerns will come to be a factor?
More and more and more. I know this doesn't matter to everyone, but it matters to some people, and it's mattering to more and more people. I know in Scotland and Ireland, distilleries are very much on the forefront of making sure that they do the right thing, and the right thing keeps changing and getting more stringent. But years ago, distilleries used to kind of drag the chain and do the minimum of what they had to, and even cut corners to try and make it look they were complying when they weren't. What I see from any distillery of any size these days is a real desire to do the right thing. And it's incredibly stringent in Scotland. If you're using river water as your cooling water, you're pumping water out of the river, obviously you've got to release that back into the river at some point. They will check the temperature of the river 1 mile down from your distillery. And if the temperature is increased by 0.5 degree or something 1 mile down from your distillery, you're in breach of the legislation.
Oh, wow.
So they have monitoring stations for each distillery. Compare this to years ago, I was told by one distillery, when you're releasing water into the river that's a bit warmer than what the normal temperature should be, it promotes algal growth, which is why you're not allowed to do it, right? And I was told by someone who had worked at the same distillery for a very long time that they had been told, they used to get hints when inspectors were coming. And one of the ways they used to inspect before they had these monitoring stations was to have people just walk down the river and see if there's algae growing on the rocks.
Very scientific, very scientific.
Apparently it works, but unless you tip them off. And there were a bunch of distillery workers out in the river with scrubbing brushes, cleaning algae off rocks before the inspectors were coming by to make sure that they didn't fall foul of the legislation. That's the old school. They don't do that kind of stuff anymore. They actually work very, very hard to comply. There are some distilleries that are moving to 100% zero carbon emissions for distilleries. One that I get asked about a lot, and I don't know if that question has occurred to anyone listening. People ask about the carbon dioxide that comes off during fermentation, carbon dioxide emissions, right?
Yeah, right.
We do use energy in the whiskey industry, so there's carbon dioxide concerns there. In fermentation, no one cares about, even the most ardent environmentalists, they don't care about the carbon dioxide coming off during fermentation, because it's what they call biologic carbon dioxide. It was all fixed in the barley before it went through malting, mashing, fermentation, and now it's just the same stuff coming off. It's a cycle that goes round and round. It'll get the same amount will get fixed in the next batch of barley, so you don't need to worry about that one.
Okay, so you could still achieve 100% zero emission and still have that carbon dioxide. So
if you're covering your energy, the carbon dioxide through your energy and everything else, you don't need to worry about the bit coming off through fermentation. That's covered through biological processes.
Very cool, very cool.
Because you had to fix it before you released it.
I'll just announce once more, those who've just tuned in, I'm live tonight with Matthew Fergusson-Stewart, who's had, like I said before, one of the most storied and interesting careers in whiskey. And I can't think of anyone else on earth who knows as much as he does. And so I'm just going to
Oh, I can.
well, maybe I can, but I mean, you know, he was meant to go along with that compliment, but that's okay. Rob Akers asks, one for both Matts. What is the biggest challenge a brand ambassador faces, and how do you approach it? I mean, that was sort of covered in the last question, but is there anything else you want to add to that one for Rob?
Mental health.
Mental health. Okay, that's a very good one. Yeah.
Mental health is a massive issue for people who work in the drinks industry generally, right? It applies to brand ambassadors and to bartenders. I think you're working a lot at night. You drink too much, some smoke too much, don't eat well, poor eating patterns, don't get enough sunlight, very irregular hours, don't get to see and socialize with their loved ones as much because of their hours they're working. These are all factors to mental health issues. And you really have to manage that, and you have to manage how much you're doing and how you're looking after yourself. Maybe it's not the biggest issue, but I think it's one of the most overlooked issues. Oh yeah, well, I mean, mental health in general is often overlooked. But there are so many risk factors in the lifestyle of a bartender or brand ambassador that make it really, really hard. Yeah, that's a very valid point. Good question, Rob. Thank you. Matt Waller asks, in Australia, we see patterns of whiskey consumption and style between winter and summer to a degree. And I'd agree with that. I'd say we see more of those sort of lighter styles and even some bourbons and stuff in summer, but then we see peated whiskeys and whatnot in winter. With Singapore being basically one season warmer, wet and wetter, do you see patterns in style of whiskey consumption over a year over there? Yeah, it's an interesting question. And the kind of almost lack of seasons here does really have an impact on a lot of things, and sometimes in ways you don't expect. If I run into an old friend, if I'm walking down the street in Perth, I say, "Oh, when did we last see each other?" And they'll normally say, "Oh, it was about in the middle of last year," because people remember things by the flow of seasons. Right. And you might remember something was, when did we go swimming together? It was obviously summer, but it wasn't last summer, so it was the summer before that. And you can narrow it down. You can't do that here. It's like I run into someone I haven't seen for a while. It could have been 12 months ago. It could have been 5 years. I really don't know, because my wardrobe never changes. It's because it's always the same temperature. If you want to know how hot it was in Singapore today, I'm not going to look it up. I'm just going to tell you it was 31 degrees, because that's how hot it is every day. With a bit of variation, but almost every day. We do have wetter and drier seasons for sure. And we do have mini heat waves, but it's not. You look quite dapper in a suit. I don't know how you wear a three-piece in summer, but I applaud you for doing so. I don't know how I do that either, but I really struggled with it when I first moved here, but you kind of adapt after a while. I guess you would. Yeah. Just like if you had to move to Tasmania for the opposite end of the spectrum or something like that. Yeah. No, we don't, it's not wet season. We'll get into the peaty stuff, and it's dry season. So we'll drink the space sides. No, because it's not really enough of an impact. And as I said, it's almost all on trade here. People drink in bars, and almost all of those bars are air conditioned as well. So it's pretty much temperature regulated once you're inside. Yeah, right. Yeah. There's a question here from Jeremy Donnet asking about carbon dioxide. How about carbon dioxide to transport empty bourbon casks across the Atlantic? Fair question. Yeah, that is definitely one of the inputs that needs to be accounted for. Some distilleries are really, really good at accounting for that, and some are still playing catch up. I believe it's Deanston accounts for all of the carbon dioxide from all inputs, and is almost 100% green as a distillery, which is really impressive. You're seeing more and more. We don't see too much Deanston over here. We don't see too much Deanston in Australia. That's a shame, because they do some tasty stuff. I mean, you can find it, but it's kind of like real sort of, you got to properly hunt for it. There's not really any bars or bottle shops that carry it. It's pretty easy to get here. Deanston Virgin Oak as an NAS is actually a cracking good whiskey. Yeah, right. We had a great discussion on here the other week about Virgin Oak, both as finishes or as full maturation in Scotch whiskey, and whether you're for or against it, my take on Virgin Oak, just as a aside, is it should be used with the same level of caution as you would any sort of sherry or wine cask. Sure. In that it could overpower the spirit.
A couple of comments here, just bouncing back to that mental health comment. Daniel and Matt both say, I agree with the mental health of bartenders. It's a challenging lifestyle. Daniel's a bartender himself. And Matt says, yes, a strong point and easily observed in BAs and bartenders. That is true.
Yeah, and I'm not as familiar with the life as a bartender. I see some of it, but having been a BA on top of that with the travel, and often at crazy hours, you might be staying in a different hotel every night. You're not staying in your own home with your loved ones. You're staying in different countries all the time. So bartenders have other factors, but there's some that are specific to brand ambassadors as well. It's not easy. I've had tough times after a couple of weeks on the road, lying in a different hotel bed and just feeling a bit miserable. It's underplaying it, feeling really, really, really quite miserable. And sometimes you need to lean on friends to help out.
Yeah. Great answer, he says. And by the way, Craig Johnston joined. So, Craig, if you want to get as sciencey as Matthew here, you're welcome to jump in. I know you. This is quite a top spot for you. Brendan says, with climate change being prevalent, this is Brendan Pillai says, with climate change being prevalent, how do you both think this would impact the future of the whiskey industry? Another very polite comment from Brendan. I'm not sure about this whole sort of him being. Okay, sorry. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, look, thankfully, I don't. It's not hitting all in one blow, right? Because the UK has a plan to be carbon neutral by 2050 or something, and they've got incremental measures to bring this in. So it's going to happen step by step. If it all came in overnight, it would kill industries for sure. At the end of the day, it is going to add something to the price of your bottle. There's no escaping that. By bringing it in slowly and allowing people to adjust and adapt in various ways, you hopefully ensure that that's not too much on the price of a bottle.
Yeah.
But I mean, we're heading towards a world where people are going to be prepared to pay that extra little bit, or are going to keep their mouth shut because they know they'll be shouted down if they do have an issue about it, which might not be a good thing. But this is the new normal, right? We've got to expect this, and we've got to adapt to it. But at the end of the day, it does add cost. There's no denying that.
Not just on a cost level, but also, there's two parts I might just add on to Brendan's question there. With his comment being with climate change being prevalent, how do you think this will impact the future of the whiskey industry? My part of that would be, how much do you think that's going to impact the flavor of and output?
Yeah, sorry, yeah, that's obviously the other side of that I didn't think of. Look, there's an input which is barley, and barley grows in a certain climate zone. That climate zone is probably going to move north, but barley might get more expensive if the growing zone is reduced. If peat bogs start to dry out, that's an enormous feedback loop for climate change, because peat bogs are an enormous sink of carbon dioxide. If they start to dry out, they start to release carbon dioxide, which is not good at all. And we need peat, obviously. And we do generate heat when we make whiskey. And the other big one's going to be aging, maturation. Macallan's not going to have the climate of Umrut anytime soon. Not with the most extreme forecasts of climate change. Is that going to happen anytime soon? I don't think the impact of climate change on aging is going to be enough that the average person will pick up. Right. Yes, it might get slightly warmer. If it gets a degree warmer in a century, an average person's whiskey drinking life is 50 years. Are they going to pick up half a degree? What the effect of half a degree change in climate on the aging of the whiskey? Obviously, that has massive effects in various ways. Yeah. But half a degree change in your warehouse over time, is that big or not? I don't think so.
Matt Willer writes, it will probably become an extra tag on a whiskey for a while. So we'll have non-chill filtered, non-caramel coloring, carbon neutral. Yeah.
It probably will.
Yeah.
And that's great. You probably have very similar views about, caramel coloring and chill filtration as I do. I don't want to see them banned, but I think that should be tagged on the bottle. I'd like to see that.
I think I said or tweeted that exact same thing just last week. It was sort of like, right. I've got no problem with caramel coloring, and I've got no problem with chill filtration. I know that, and that shocks people to hear that sometimes coming from me. from working for the SMWS that where we don't do either of those things, and I'm an advocate against them. But at the same time, I'm actually like, I understand the need for them in product, and for outside the 5% of or 0.1% of single malts. I just wish it was always disclosed. Now, whether it be disclosed as a tiny little tag on the back label or something of the bottle is fine. But what's the German one? Mit Farbstoff. My German's terrible. Sorry, but it's something like that. Is with coloring, with caramel. Sorry, with caramel. Yeah, and
and I think that's the way it should be. It's not the way it is, but and that's not just going to be for whiskey. There will eventually be a carbon neutral tag for any product that you're going to buy.
Yeah,
and that's good. Informed consumers are good consumers, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And as the education level we see rise over time, and this is also country by country, the education level of your average consumer increases. And I think that is a slow moving train, that one. But I think it's always in the right direction. At least it's moving forward rather than back.
Yeah, and a lot of we're getting in a field of social change here, which is probably more than a little deeper.
We down this path tonight, and actually, I think we've taken enough questions for now, and I really appreciate everyone for tuning in. Matthew, can I have you on again sometime?
I'd love to, man. What are you doing tomorrow? No,
maybe in a few weeks it'll be great.
No, I know you've got plans tomorrow. I might be tuning in as well because you got Dominic Roscoe on, which I'm looking forward to. He's a great guy.
Yeah. No, thank you for that plug. I do have Dominic Roscoe on tomorrow night. If you don't know Dominic's works, he's written about a dozen books on whiskey. He's one of the most celebrated whiskey authors, and is a true character. And I'm looking forward to having him on the live stream tomorrow. And I just want to take an opportunity to on behalf of all the society members in Australia and indeed around the world, thank you so much for taking the time to chat with us tonight. We've gone over time, but I really appreciate your insights and your knowledge on all the topics we've been able to touch on tonight. It's been great.
I'm also working on a book map, so we'll there'll be more about that soon as well. So
all these mysteries.
We're working on a few things at the moment, but the book is one of them. So.
Well, I'd love to make that book available to our members as well, actually. So
cool.
Yeah. Especially with your history. So
not ready yet, but
No. If you want to leak the first chapter, you know where to find me. Hayden says could listen to a Matt Fest all night. So we'll do a 5-hour stream sometime, Hayden. There you go.
Get Wooler on here. Come on.
Yeah. We need Wooler in here as well. We need a few other Matts in here. Hayden Dare made one last comment about saying there's already great local examples in Australia like Belgrove that run the distillery on biofuel. Hopefully smaller distilleries like this can be an industry leader in promoting change. Couldn't agree more. Exactly. Lead by example. And if you can run your distillery on biofuel, which Peter Bignell does over at Belgrove, that's fantastic. Thank you. Rob Scott says, ask Matt about the legend of Mall Santa. I think he means for you to ask me about Mall Santa, but that's a discussion for another time. Rob, the world does not need to know about Mall Santa. That chapter has died. I'm sorry.
We'll be following up on that.
Yeah, we'll be following up on that one. In the meantime, again, thank you so much. And I'll see everyone, for everyone who's been tuning in, Dominic Roscoe tomorrow night. And of course, Thursday's a stream with Dram Nation. Friday is our Tassie chat with the guests to be announced. Huge shout out again to Matthew Fergusson-Stewart, who took the time out of his day in Singapore to catch up with us and provide some entertainment and something to the whiskey community to learn from. Thank you again.
It's been a great pleasure, man. Cheers.
Thank you so much. Thanks everyone asking great questions, and we'll see you all tomorrow with Dom Roscoe. See you soon.